Welcome to the Consultant's Way podcast, your go-to resource for all things professional services consulting. Brought to you by McMahon & Ransford, a strategy consulting firm with over 30 years of experience helping B2B organizations achieve sustainable growth, and the Consultant's Way, the leading comprehensive consultant development program. Hosted by Dean McMahon and Anthony Paluska, we share expert insights, firsthand experiences, and conversations with industry leaders on the topics that interest you most.
The views and opinions expressed by guests on this podcast are their own and do not necessarily reflect the views or positions of their employer, company, or affiliated organizations.
Welcome, everybody, to the Consultant's Way podcast. I am Anthony Paluska, and I'm here with Dean McMahon. And today we're lucky to be joined by Ghazal Moore. Ghazal's an experienced professional services executive with experience not just within professional services, but touching the operations side of the business, in the technology space, and spanning across multiple industries and organizations from startups all the way up into the Fortune 500, Fortune 1000 types of organizations. So a breadth of experience that Ghazal brings to us today, and we're excited to have you, Ghazal. Welcome to the podcast, and please feel free to add to that introduction and introduce yourself a bit.
Yes, first of all, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. I'm super excited to be here today. And as you mentioned, I would say over the last 20 years, I've been really lucky to have had a diverse set of experiences across services. Started my career in management consulting, then shifted to SaaS, managing PS, CS, and training teams, everything from, like you said, organizational strategy through operations, from SMB customer small all the way through the most complex enterprise projects. And I, also lucky enough to be able to take a detour from the corporate world to work on a passion project, which was in the residential real estate management space, but was a very enriching opportunity. So I'm really looking forward to sharing some of those services experiences here with you guys today.
Great. And I know as we've been talking in advance of this, there's a key theme that we want, that you really want to make sure we focus on and make sure that the audience and the community knows. And that's this concept of, and I'll let you explain it in more detail, but that's this concept of kind of navigating the SaaS KPIs and the impact that whole journey looks like on professional services, and the role that professional services plays as a loss leader in product companies often. Please, expand upon that. You'll say it much more articulately than me, and then we'll dive into some questions.
Yeah, absolutely. So yes, many SaaS companies, still today here in 2025, face ongoing confusion, right, about whether their professional services should be a loss leader or a profitable unit. This is not a new problem, and there's probably many reasons for this. But first, I want to differentiate, two scenarios. One is the organization that has declared themselves a loss leader, right? It's a deliberate strategy, the KPIs align, everyone's on board, and there's a plan for how we invest in services. As compared to other organizations that are still trying to balance those revenue goals with a giveaway culture to drive short-term deals. And of course, the latter of those two scenarios is the much harder one to operate in. And as you guys know, I'm sure in consulting firms, the goalpost is always clear. Services drive revenue, right? But in SaaS, that goalpost shifts constantly, sometimes quarterly or more. Another key difference of SaaS is that the services exist to, drive onboarding and adoption. The revenue itself may be insignificant as compared to the subscription cost, for a new logo or for an upsell. I think there's always the thought that if you give customers access to free services, the adoption and the product sales will improve, but that's not always true. Other times there's a perception that we can't ask budget-sensitive customers for more money because it's going to slow the deal down. Sometimes we see that sales isn't appropriately armed to defend those services, or there isn't a strong enough stance on giveaways, so it can get abused. But I will say, admittedly, it's not always easy to keep up with the training and education that evolving sales teams require. So, we may find that as a result, the organization is, negotiating with itself. At the end of the day, it's about strong leadership, And so if you have a lack of alignment between, cross-functionally between PS, sales, PS, CS, sales, and leadership, that can lead to misaligned expectations, poor long-term planning. And I think that's why, we see this issue still persist today.
Yeah. I mean, you explained those two scenarios at the beginning where, hey, this is great. Our organization, our professional services organization, and the broader corporation have a shared opinion of the role professional services plays in the organization. We've set our goals, our metrics, everything according to that strategic role that the professional services organization is going to play. Very few organizations have it figured out in that way. So almost everybody is dealing with this identity crisis a little bit, and this constant shift of, okay, what is professional services role, and what does that mean about how PS interacts with sales, CS, and then executive leadership across the board? Not to mention just how to measure success and performance, and are we actually achieving that role that we're playing there? Why do you think, and you touched on this just a little bit, but maybe you go a little bit deeper, why do you think that there is this constant identity crisis between what PS should be, wants to be, ought to be, from PS's perspective and from the rest of the corporation?
Yeah, so I think, again, for those that are in that latter scenario, we're trying to balance the revenue with the giveaway culture. And we're never really sure which play we're making at what part of the game, right? I think PS teams are often juggling revenue, gross margin, billable utilization KPIs, but they're also responsible for customer acquisition and retention goals. And so when PS, CS, and sales and leadership are not all aligned, really the devil's in the details in terms of how the services team supports the retention and acquisitions. Which if you don't have a plan for it, it can deteriorate into free services at the expense of meeting these financial targets. So now we're in the game and the goalpost is changing mid-quarter. And when PS is viewed as a loss leader, it can undermine the value of services internally and externally. So it can lead to confusion in this identity crisis. Are we here to just move adoption forward at all costs, or are we trying to create a sustainable P&L?
I'm sorry, but I think part of the problem is the hangover we have from the initiation of how SaaS was valued, which was monthly payments. I mean, let's just, okay. So hookups, new accounts, all that mattered for valuation. And we now have over 17,000 SaaS companies in the US, and every one of those management teams, most of those management teams were baptized into that culture. So when they get, and you and I've talked about this, when they get to mid-size, where retention matters more and long-term value of customers, they are ill-prepared for that complexity, because what they've been rewarded for, trained on, and made their money on was what we could call early stage. So when they come in, or they're there, when the game changes, they're not used to that. So sometimes they hit the gas and say, we've got to give away more services. Right? Now, we believe, as we've gathered data, that, as you mentioned, giving away things does not endear relationships because it's not valued. So we love the problem. We love where you are with it. And it's an educational issue for the leaders of companies on how they run a business model that is different than the business, I think, than they think they're running. Is that fair, you think?
Absolutely. And there are impacts to that are, short-term and long-term, right? So when you don't have, or when you have employees that don't feel valued because we're undermining the value of those services, not only do they not feel valued, but they're also not meeting these financial targets, right? And so they're doing what the organization has asked, but it's creating an immense amount of frustration, reduced performance, and higher attrition. Employees, like everybody else, and high performers specifically, they need clear goals, right? Fair compensation and growth opportunities. So retention, I think retention is impacted. It's the shorter term risk, but there are other long-term risks too. But yes, I going back to your point, I absolutely agree that as you move through the stages of from startup and onwards, your strategy will shift and change. And you may find yourself back to where you were at the startup stage or worse, depending, on the focus on net retention.
I saw a chart the other day. It said startup, sick, stable. And I thought that was really good, right? We do startup really well, and if we ever get to stable, we do that really well. But it's this, and most of them are in that, as you have mentioned. Yeah. Yeah. So, but you talked about attrition. One thing we found that affects attrition positively is investing in them with development, right? Just showing it's the Hathorn effect, if you remember that from grad school. But just showing interest and investing them a little bit gives them the feeling that although we're confused, we at least care about me personally getting better.
Yes, but I think you see, though, unfortunately, that loss leaders often underinvest, right?
Yeah, no,
In the
no, no.
training and
It's not easy
operation.
to get them to agree to do it.
Yeah,
No.
yeah. But if you're not investing in training, operations, technology, and the employee development, then you're further weakening that function, right? And over time, the P&L doesn't have the ability to maintain top talent. You find yourself downsizing and finding weaker service quality as a result. Now you're impacting your CSATs and your NPS. And as you mentioned very clearly, the customers aren't going to see the value if you don't internally see that value. So it's going to be much harder for the teams to drive or deliver those high quality implementations. The customers likely might not have the skin in the game. So even if you are investing or if you're not, right, at the end of the day, if the customers don't see the value and they're not committing and they don't have skin in the game, then it's gonna deteriorate your ability to deliver those high quality services.
Yeah, and it feels like we're just piling on to why this is such a big problem, and I want to get to some suggestions you have on how to fix that. But an additional piece is, right, as we know, professional services happens at the client site. And so the professional services team's ability to drive a positive customer experience depends a little bit on their own attitude. And when we don't have a clear understanding within the organization of professional services role, even if it is as a loss leader, it creates that animosity across functions and this dissatisfaction around, right? Professional services might have a revenue target, but sales isn't selling as much professional services as professional services needs to achieve its particular target. And there's frustration about sales' inability to do that and their lack of value in that. Or conversely, professional services knows that or doesn't appreciate that their primary role in the organization is to drive adoption and stickiness and make it all work. And so as they do quote unquote free or discounted work, at least in their mind, against what the value could be in the open market for that, they don't put as much energy and attention and effort into that. And the customers feel that. And so this disconnect creates negative job satisfaction and therefore even some animosity towards the organization or towards other functions. But the one that really suffers in that is the customer. And then as a result, the whole organization.
Yes, you're referring to the F word. I mean, friction. We don't want any of that, right? But that's exactly what happens is that, meanwhile, when there's this identity crisis, the tension between sales and PS continues to grow, right? As we see sales prioritize immediate bookings over sustainable service revenue. So, yes, absolutely, the case. And I think that it's important to understand, the services teams, sometimes are working on really complex products. Let's think about what they're doing, right? Complex products, complex customers. It's really critical to the success of the business to maintain that continuity and the institutional knowledge. The business can't survive without it. So yes, absolutely, I agree with you that when we, create this disconnect between the corporate wins and the team successes, we're impacting retention and KPIs, are undermining value, but we're also creating that internal rift. And so that's creating greater amount of friction when we really should be, seamless, right? Left hand should be talking to the right hand, and oftentimes we see that's a big impact.
So let's move to the positive side of this horrific problem and talk about wonderful, easy, well, not easy, but wonderful things we can do begin to move our organizations to a healthier place.
Absolutely.
And I know you have a three-step plan, I'm just kidding, that we can write down.
I do.
All organizations can do it right now and easy.
I'm about to list three things, so that's exactly right.
Hey, I knew you came from a consulting firm. It's three things or five things. That's it.
That's right. It's 3 or 5. That's exactly right. No, I'm really bullish that SaaS companies can meet organizational goals, like big organizational goals, while still building a profitable services organization at the same time. I've done it personally, so I know it can be done. And you have to focus on 3 areas. We've been talking about the strong leadership and cross-functional alignments are the first one. The second one is offsetting revenue with service offerings. I'll touch on that a little bit more in a second. And then the third one is sales enablement. So I think those are the 3 keys to kind of getting yourself out of this situation. So let me kind of briefly explain what each of them are. Strong alignment, of course, we've been talking about cross-functionally, but also defining what is and isn't a giveaway. And then how are we going to stick to it? Who's responsible for making these decisions? Have we limited, who can approve giveaways and so forth? The second category, offsetting giveaways and services, I think first starts with, do we even have the right pricing, the right margins? Let's take a look at that, rates, et cetera. But then are we driving value-added change orders to offset where we have discounts and giveaways? Are we looking at reoccurring service subscriptions? And I think really importantly, to your point of that sort of middle, the middle of the road there, having these post-implementation services for large enterprise customers so that we can keep their platforms and their processes healthy. So PS doesn't have to come in and do a dive and say for free to get their renewal or to really make a stronger impact, on the net retention as we kind of grow. Discounts versus giveaways. It's always better to co-invest versus to give away altogether. And then the last category is that sales enablement, also super important. I would say the first thing you should do is compensate the sales reps and watch the culture shift. Compensating them on services, that is, right? A lot of people don't necessarily, a lot of orgs don't necessarily do that. But then we need to invest in on-demand training, right? To help sales understand what the value is, but also how to communicate that to the customer. Boot camps and annual sales training presentations are not enough. That we really need to have these resources on demand for sales reps as we see new reps come in. In addition, we also want to leverage automation because we have to scope those services in a timely manner, right? Quotes, SOWs, remembering that sales is also our customer. And then finally, I would say scoping out some unbillable time for sales support so that, and making sure that's accounted for in our KPIs so that sales isn't stuck defending the value of these services alone. So I think if you have the executive support, the cross-functional alignment, and then some of these strategies, you will find it much easier to move towards profitability.
2 things you said that we really stress. I loved your outline, by the way. We may help work with you to put that into something we send to the whole community. But one is when you're dealing with sales, particularly because they're not the same group year in and year out, the just-in-time nature. So when we created all our, how to work with your PS group as a sales rep material, it's not just immersion. It's, I'm going into the meeting. I can go look at that 3-minute video on this message. We think that's really powerful. Also, the other thing, we're so encouraging everyone to get those post-implementation deals. PS is the stickiest thing you have. Let them heal their revenue by doing more work, but let's hold them accountable to learn how to do that. Because most of the 17,000 aren't doing that today, right? And they're not equipped to, they don't have leaders that have done that as you have and understand it. But I think they need to be. Those are 2 big things that we really would love to see changed.
Yeah, I think the couple of key pieces that came out of that jumped out to me were, in addition to the ones Dean just mentioned, this notion of tracking your time and setting goals and targets for your time that's associated with how much are we doing as free or discounted or co-invested type work versus how much time are we going to spend on full fees work. So that helps us build up to our budget. And then the third one is how much time are we spending in the sales support or the come in and rescue an account situation, right? And so if we can set targets around those and depending on right where the organization is and its level of time tracking, sophistication, and maturity, right, we sometimes just have a lot of those things that just fall into this giant non-billable category because it's not directly attributed to a client project that they're paying for. And if we're doing that, we're missing the opportunity to quantify how much value we're adding to the organization for our internal conversations to help grow and increase alignment. And when the goalposts do shift and they say, well, by the way, we now have to start to generate more revenue, and we push back and say, well, we don't have the capacity to do that, we can start to show, okay, this isn't just non-billable time, this is value added work that we are doing to help drive the overall enterprise. And so I think that concept is one that is an important one that we need to start thinking about, and a pretty tactical change that organizations can make.
And admittedly, it's harder to do that in small orgs or in larger orgs. You see, entire unbillable, sort of either individuals or teams working with sales. Sometimes I've even seen them, matrixed in, right, or on the sales side. But it's harder when you're smaller, and you're likely trying to meet these utilization targets at the same time as you're trying to carve out the unbillable time in order to support sales. And I think that can certainly lead to, some additional frustration and friction. But it's, again, going back to that executive alignment and cross-functional collaboration. If you have that carved out, it's much easier not just to respond to those fire drills that we need to do with the customers, but also to help drive some of this training and education and automation that takes unbillable time, and we have to invest in it.
Yeah. How do you just, because it's a topic that's top of mind right now, because I've got a couple of clients that are solving this problem in different ways, and I think there are different ways to solve it, but curious what your opinion on this is. In that space, we have solution engineers, solution architects, are technical SMEs, right, that are not necessarily consultants, that in this case, they live in this hybrid world between sales and professional services. They help support deals, they help do everything from product demos all the way through to helping explain some of the services and connect the dots in many organizations. But if there isn't this really clear alignment and communication about how people should be spending their time, I've seen that role take things way too far in terms of delivering professional services as part of the sales process as a workaround to actually going through the standards that the PS team has put in place to make all this work. So I don't, you're smiling and nodding a little bit. Any experience or guidance for everybody that's dealing with some element of that?
Right. I think it's a double-edged sword in a way. I think the sales engineer is armed to be just dangerous enough where they can bypass PS, right? But often we find that they're the best partners if we have a really strong working relationship with the sales engineers. They're often our first line of defense, right? We might be training the sales reps on kind of the broader aspects of the process and the messaging, but it's really the sales engineers that can kind of, connect the dots, know when to bring PS in, know when, we really need to better defend the value of services, either through better understanding of all of the strategy and the technical work that our teams are doing, what impacts that's going to have. As with any SaaS, product, there's usually multiple ways to skin the cat, right? So I think the key is making sure customers understand there's a lot of different ways you can do this. We can cut corners. We can, you can try to do some of this on your own. That comes up sometimes too. But ultimately, the PS team's value proposition is that we can get you to, that end state faster, right? And probably with a better outcome than you can do on your own, or kind of stringing it together with, the sales engineer, the sales rep, and the internal organization. So, yeah, sometimes it's not just about even free, work or giveaways. It's really about the extent to which PS is brought in at what time in order to make the best impact for the customer. So we start with the sales engineers as our partner, for whether it's scoping or whether it's knowing when to bring us in. But it certainly depends on the relationship that you have with your sales organization and those sales engineers and their understanding of the PS organization. I would not recommend, though, that unless that sales engineer is actually delivered, right, that we replace that sales engineer, or excuse me, that we replace the PS staff with the sales engineer in the process, because I think we're doing a disservice to the overall deal.
Yeah, I love the answer, and it fits right in underneath your sales enablement category as well, because sales enablement, sometimes we get into this habit of saying we need to train our sales organization, be it our sales reps or our sales engineers, on how to scope, how to identify, how to sell and introduce professional services into the equation. But so much of sales enablement is also role clarity around what are the roles each of us play in this process to make sure we're delivering the right customer outcome. And then also just being easy to work with. I find the most often when that problem occurs, the sales engineers over delivering and trying to use that, the sales team trying to use that resource to work around PS, it's because we've made ourselves difficult to work with. And we've labeled ourselves as this black box of, we can do all of these things, just pull us in this instance. And they form a tighter, more comfortable relationship with the sales engineers, and we need to help demystify what professional services can do and build that strong relationship and make sure those roles are clear, because the customer wins in the end. PS is the one most equipped to deliver the best outcome when it gets into a professional services type engagement. And if our sales engineer is doing that to work around something we're doing wrong internally, that hurts the customer outcome as well as how everybody's spending their time internally. So
yeah, and that's why I mentioned before, it's important to understand sales is also your customer, right? And if we don't treat sales as our customer, we're not building that credibility with sales, whether it's turnaround times for SOWs, quotes, support in meetings, then I think they do start to take other shortcuts or, use other resources within the organization to try to achieve similar results. So absolutely, they're our customer, and we have to make it, seamless, both in terms of their resources to better understand what we do, the processes, the automation that they engage with us in to generate these quotes, as well as knowing that we have, their back when it comes to defending the value of services with customers.
One thing that I've always been surprised about in the free work is, there are, and this is very technical, but there are generally accepted accounting principles called GAAP. And if you discount services, the GAAP rule is the product actually is discounted because they don't want you to take revenue ahead of implementation. So I'm always surprised that no PS executives ask the GAAP question.
You're right, they don't. Yes.
Yeah, but believe me, the auditors that audit these companies care a great deal about that. So what we're doing is we're falsifying in some way our revenue, because we're moving that revenue up as opposed to, and it's mitigated somewhat by revenue being billed monthly, right? But there's still an interesting GAAP question, but as you said, most PS people don't think that way.
Yeah, and you got to take that into account when you're thinking about, is this a fixed price? Is this going to be, T&M? And if it is fixed price, how are we actually, recognizing that revenue relative to how we're delivering it? So all of that is very important in terms of how we structure. And I think people do think about it when you're structuring the offerings, but when it comes to more of the giveaways, I think it does become an afterthought.
Well, this has been great, and really appreciate you telling us, how to fix it. And I know now, in a month or two, this is all going to be behind us, and no one will have a problem with it. And I'm really excited about that. So, as we wrap up today, give us a couple of just takeaways you want everybody to know, and then we'll let Anthony ask you. Anthony, before she does takeaways, anything else you want to ask?
No, I appreciate the insights here and the discussion. So yeah, we can dive into some takeaways.
Yeah, no, thank you. I guess I just want to say I'm a people leader first, right? As most leaders are in organizations. It's the most important job that I play and what I care most about in any role I've been in. So creating that positive, supportive growth culture is the best way to build these high performing teams with low attrition. I really believe that the NPS, the employee NPS, is a mirror of the customer NPS. So it's important to get it right. If your employees aren't happy, that's going to bleed through to your customers, whether it's because of retention or weakening of the function or all these things that we've been talking about. So just want to leave, with that services functions don't have to accept loss leader terms to have a successful business. And I hope that if you do, it's deliberate, like we were talking about earlier. But it's harder to make that a long-term play for the business. It's going to have negative employee and customer impacts. So really partnering with leadership and cross-functional leaders to ensure everyone's on the same page and that the value of services across the organization is clear is super important. But it's possible. Like I said, I've done it. I've been there, and I would love to work with you guys on figuring out how to disseminate some of that more broadly.
Yeah, that'd be great. Well, thank you, Ghazal.
Look forward to seeing you again.
Thank you guys so much.
Well, thank Ghazal for joining us today. I think the problem that she's on and that key topic and some of her suggestions are relevant to almost everybody that we're working with, right? There is this constant tension and struggle where, what is the role of professional services? What are the expectations of them? And then how do they play that role effectively inside their organization? And the ideal state is always going to be, all right, well, just get alignment and get some permanent strategic alignment from your corporation and from a PS organization, and then just move forward on that for several years. But the reality of it is that's not the case. And so some of the tactics that she suggested at the end, I think are required for almost every organization. Things around, right, just making sure we're just really clear about how we communicate, about what we're doing, about drawing some boundaries and lines about what's free, what's not free, what's included for this reason versus that reason, and tracking our time associated with that. And then that whole concept we were on around how do you enable and become a partner to your other key functions, sales, customer success, etc. I think everybody can benefit from something like that.
Yeah, I think the thing that I would suggest everybody do is, because of what we talked about, the management of the firms right now, is own every day educating them about how your team's spending time, what the trade-offs were. Make that your main objective and educate them about the stickiness, and just be repetitive with data. And that's your best chance to get them to have some consistent strategy, right? Because they're just not programmed to understand where you're coming from.
Yeah, we won't necessarily make them have a consistent strategy, but we will communicate with them consistently enough for the duration of it, so that we can at least explain in the same metrics and terms, well, that decision and these things are impacting this element of, so we're just saying, hey, utilization's going down, or our revenue is impacted in this way, or whatever the thing is. And the reason for that is these other decisions that are made. So we're setting and establishing the baseline for how we communicate. So as the strategy shifts, we can just help everybody understand the implications of decisions that as an organization we're making.
Absolutely. The one other takeaway I got from her, which we stress all the time, is, hey, go ahead and get an upsell. Go ahead and make up your revenue. It helps you. It's sticky, and it pulls through product better, right? Get your portfolio together.
Yeah, there's a role that you play no matter what in controlling your own destiny and driving some of the revenue and commercial outcomes for your organization, even if the other role that you play internally is a loss leader to help drive adoption, right? There's still other things that you can do, and you need to embrace that attitude, because it doesn't really matter what role you're playing. getting an upsell and expansion, continuing to help the client and getting them to generate more revenue for your organization will always be valued. So, no, I thought that was great. And thanks to her again for coming on and talking through all of that with us. For everybody else out there, if you enjoyed what you're listening to, please like and subscribe to us on YouTube and your podcast channels. And then if you have any suggestions about future topics, future guests, Dean's hat color, whatever the topic is, feel free to reach out to us on LinkedIn or email us at podcast@theconsultantsway.com. Thanks.